Yeah, thanks everyone for joining today. Today we're going to walk through learn all about JavaScript, what it is, how we can use it. I'm going to give you some challenges to work on at the end, but we're going to go through what JavaScript is, when to use it, how to use it, and sort of everything in between. So let's actually jump in, and I just want to give you a quick background on what Thinkful is. So we're basically a school that trains web developers and data scientists through sort of this one-on-one mentorship and this project-based learning. And a lot of people do this like looking to transition careers. I know we had a couple people in those polls say that they're kind of looking to change careers. And that's sort of what we aim to do. A lot of it is people coming in with different backgrounds from all these different diverse backgrounds that are looking to get into tech. And that's what we help people do. And like I said, we have this one-on-one mentorship. So I'm a mentor that has, I'll have students that I meet with twice a week to kind of go over anything that they're working through, anything that they're stuck on, and just making sure they feel comfortable and that they're learning at the rate that they feel like they're comfortable with. I'm going to try. So if it works in IE in that firm, I will be amazed, because usually that's the other way around. But yeah, I would try maybe just restarting Chrome. Make sure you, if you can't, I don't know if you can see me. Make sure you don't have ad blockers. Try updating Chrome. Yeah, if anyone has questions about Thinkful afterward, I'm going to stick around. I'll be happy to tell you anything, any questions you have, or tell you as much as I can, anything that you would find helpful. Cool. So without any further ado, let's jump into what we're going to be looking at here tonight, and what this really means when we say JavaScript. Because when we say JavaScript, we can mean just a lot of different things, because you can use JavaScript, for example, on both what's called the front end and the back end, or for example, the client and the server. So when you think of a client, that's probably what you'll be most familiar with if you don't have any experience or haven't thought about this before. But a client is what's basically what your user is going to be seeing. So anytime you visit a web page, even if you're looking at this event tonight, what you're seeing right now, all the user interface that you're seeing is the front end. That's what this client is going to be. The client's going to be sending requests to get data, and it's going to be what the users are seeing. Front stack, back stack, yeah. So the backend is going to be what the server, or what happens behind the scenes. So the client's going to be sending requests for data, and the backend is going to be fulfilling those requests and sending them back to the front end. So you can think of front end is what the users see, back end is what the app does. And we can use JavaScript on both sides of these. We're not going to be writing, for the most part, any back-end JavaScript, but a lot of what we're going to be writing today is applicable to both the front and back end. It's kind of synonymous with no matter what part you're working in. So I don't want to get too in the weeds of what this means, but it's important to start thinking about these sort of things and start thinking about what a client is, what a server is, because it's more than likely you're going to use JavaScript on either, but especially on the front end. Any single web page that you'll see, if it's a modern web page that has anything dynamic on it, it's going to be it's going to include JavaScript in that. Cool. And like I said, if anyone has any questions anytime, just feel free to post those in chat, or if you need me to reiterate something. So another way to look at that is this client-server relationship, where a request might look like an initial request for a web page. So we open our browser and we navigate to facebook.com. That's going to be a request. Our client is making a request to the server saying, hey, I'm requesting data from this URL, this facebook.com. So I need you to give me back something. So the client makes this request, the server gets that, it determines what it needs to load, and then it's going to send back whatever it is. And if you're on facebook.com, a lot of it's just going to be HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files, along with a whole bunch of other stuff. And then the browser is going to be the thing that renders that. So when you get back your HTML, your CSS, and your JavaScript, the browser is actually the thing that determines like how to render that. So specifically tonight, we're going to be looking at the well, not that part, that JavaScript part of it. It's actually circling the wrong one there. But we're going to be looking at the JavaScript part of this. We do have HTML and CSS courses that we do offer, but this will just be more or less focusing on the JavaScript part of this. So let's start and look at some JavaScript and see what that really looks like. So we see this right here is an example of something that you'll see in pretty much any part of JavaScript. And this is a good introduction or a good place to start because this is how you would define a variable in JavaScript. And a variable is just something that holds, you can think of it as something that holds data or just something that holds a value that you can reference later on. So what that means is this is a very basic example where we're saying let number of sheep equal 20. So if we do this in our code right here, anytime we want to reference 20 again, all we have to do is say number of sheep. But let's go through this kind of piece by piece and break this down. So this let right here, the first thing that's going to happen here, this is going to initialize the variable, and this is going to tell our JavaScript, hey, I need you to make some new memory. I'm going to create something new, and I need you to kind of store that for me. So that's what this does. And this should only be used the very first time you're declaring a variable and not any other time. Because if we try and say let number of sheep something else, we're going to get an error here that says, hey, number of sheep has already been declared. You can't redeclare it. So this part here is just going to be the name of our variable. And the name of our variable can really be anything we want it to. It's generally good practice to name it something closely correlated to what it is or what it does. So in this case, number of sheep. I always like to kind of like block this part out and just look at the variable name and see if I can guess what it might be based on the name of it. So if I were to block out this equals 20 and just look at this, I'd probably guess that this is a number of some sort. Right, because that's what it's telling me it is. We wouldn't want to just put sheep here, like let sheep equal 20, because that doesn't necessarily say this is definitely a number. This could be like a name of a sheep or something. So we want to say, hey, let number of sheep equal 20. So if other people come into our code base later on, it's kind of easier for them to navigate through, right? It's not going to be as confusing. And then when we say equal, this equal is just an assignment. We're just saying, hey, assign this name to this value. That's all that's happening here. So anytime we want to see number of sheep, anytime we want to use this 20 value, we can just say number of sheep, like somewhere down here. If we wanted to say number of sheep, if we wanted to print that out, we would just say number of sheep here. Does that make sense? Are there any questions about that? Anything I can sort of help reiterate? We're going to look at some live code here in just a second. But yeah, if you have any questions, please let me know. So let's look at what this looks like in practice. So I'm going to hop over to this website called codepen.io here. It's part of the slides if you have those open. And this is just like an interactive code sandbox that's going to allow us to just practice some things here. Let me actually change this view. I think this might be a little bit easier to read. Cool. So yeah, so this is an example of what we just saw when we're declaring a variable number of sheep and a variable name of sheep. Well, we haven't seen name yet, but we just saw a number. And then when we're at console.log, this is just going to say print the values to this console here. That's all that's doing. So anything in between these parentheses and a console log is just printing the values. Can you change the value later on? Yes. So let's look at how we might do that. First, let's do name of sheep here, and then just separate it with a comma. And I see you raised your hand there. Yeah, if you have any questions, you can just post them there. Yeah, but if you have another question, feel free to post it in there. So we can see name of sheep, we can see number of sheep. So let's just get rid of this. And let's say we got more sheep, right, than just the 25. We can say number of sheep equals 25. We're also going to get rid of name of sheep here because that's no longer a variable. Clear our console, rerun this. And we see that we got 25. Sweet. So it's important to know that this JavaScript engine is going to run top down, which means that if we were to do this and then rerun that, we should get 20 here, and we do, because this log is happening right here in time, which means that at this point, number of sheep is still 20. It doesn't get reassigned until down here on line 5. So by the time it says, hey, console.log this value, it's still equal to 20 there. So it's important to layer these things correctly because you can very easily get values that aren't correct just because things are sort of overriding each other, or things aren't changing when you would expect them to. So let's go, let's see here and do name of sheep. Sean, right? So in JavaScript, it's important to think about the different types of values that things can be. So in just the last example, we saw an example where a value or a variable was a number, right? And that's what it's called in JavaScript. Its type is number. So when we do something in between quotes right here, this is called a type string. And a string is just a block of text surrounded in in quotations. And that's how JavaScript treats that, as a string. So let's go back to here and say, let's actually undo this and say number of sheep. Let's say we had total sheep. Like I said, at this point, you have two different values for name of sheep. You can't have two primitive values, but you can have data structures that hold multiple types of values. And we can see that a little bit later on. So we can have things that hold multiple values. They just need to be a different data structure. This is called a primitive type. We'll see what a non-primitive type is. And you can change the value later on, as we saw before. But if we wanted to do total sheep, we can use this just as a number, which we can do something like number of sheep plus 30 or something like this. And then we can just console log that here. So we can do these math additions and subtractions and anything that we sort of wanted to do. And JavaScript will handle that for us. And now we have negative 10 sheep. All our sheep are gone. So does anyone, so I got a pop quiz for people real quick. So if we did let's do something like Sean. Does anyone know what will happen without running it yourself? If you just took a guess, if I were to run this right now, what would the results be? What would print out in our console here? So we have Sean as a string plus number of sheep. So Sean plus 20. Does anyone want to take a guess, or maybe you know, before you try and run it locally, just try and think about what's going on here. So we get some errors. Iterating automatic type conversions. Anyone else want to take a wager? We're not really wagering anything, but take a guess. What would happen here? So if you said error or some type of strange thing, not a number, I think looking at this, so we can just write strings like this. We don't have to set it to anything. For the sake of it, I can do name of sheep equals Sean, and then just do this. But that's effectively doing the same thing. The only difference is we're storing this string to something in JavaScript. So let's actually do it. We got some good guesses here. Sean 20. And that's exactly what we get. So this is, to me, this is strange, because in any other programming language, if you were to try and do this, what we're doing is adding two different primitive types together. So we're trying to add a number and we're trying to add a string. In my opinion, this should fail. This should throw an error and say, hey, you're trying to do something a little bit weird here. I'm going to stop you. Instead, JavaScript says, you know what, just do what you need to do, and I'll do my best to figure out the rest. So we get back Sean 20. And this is because in JavaScript, there's something called string concatenation, where you can bring two strings together into one string, which means if we do last name of sheep equals Smithy, we could do something like this, and now total doesn't really apply. This is concatenating strings, which means it's just bringing two strings together and giving you back a single one. Back when we have a number, that's what's happening. Oops. That's what's happening here, is that it sees a string and then converts this number to a string and then concatenates it into this string. We use our variable here. So this isn't super important. Number of sheep gets returned as a string. So it's not a string at this point, but JavaScript converts that to a string and then concatenates it into name of sheep. So it's not super important that you memorize this specific thing. I think it's good to know. It's definitely good to know if you run into this thing. But I think the main point here is that there's a lot of things that JavaScript does that I consider to be weird. And if you ever run into a problem where you think, hey, this is kind of strange, a lot of times it's JavaScript just being weird and not you particularly. But just know that if you used multiply string with Python, no. So that only works for this because this is the sort of the string concatenator, and that's what's happening here when it's saying, instead of adding like you would think in numbers, just bring in this string and join it with this string. This is just sort of like saying join. Yeah, it's not likely you'll run into this right away, but in case you do, I think it's just good to start wrapping your head around and thinking about these sorts of things. So you might also see, not that, you might also see variables declared like this. Does anyone know the difference, or has anyone seen anything about let or const, or might know the difference between the two? Because someone was asking about ES6 versus ES5, and that just means the versions of JavaScript that have come out. I think ES10 is the latest right now. But ES6 is when there was like significant changes to a lot of pieces of JavaScript and how they worked. That's why you hear a lot about like ES6, and you might see that on an application like, hey, do you know ES6, something like that. But the idea here, and yeah, Trey is pointing out a piece of this, is that you can sort of think of const as something whose value shouldn't be changing, which means that if we, let's get rid of this. If we tried to do here, number of sheep equals 25, and then tried to run this, we would get an error here that says assignment to a constant variable. Yeah, and it looks like some people are touching onto that. Yeah. So if you're making a new variable, always prefer, well, so this is an opinion, so this isn't something I'm saying is fact, but I like to think of it as always start off by declaring something with const, and then if I think I need to change it, then change it to let. I think one of the strengths there is that if I were to walk into a code base and like I saw, say these are all different variables here, oops, we're going to get a bunch of errors here, but say I walk into a code base and there's like what, eight or so, seven or so variables, and I see a bunch of them are const, then in my head I can say, okay, these are the variables that probably don't change throughout this code base. And in code bases, it's pretty common to have like hundreds of lines of code, right? So if I can safely assume that these values aren't going to be changing, that sort of helps me as I'm going through the rest of the code and figuring things out. If there's any like bugs or weird things going on, it can be helpful for me to know what values won't change versus if I see like let's here, then I assume there's a reason that two of the variables are declared with let. I can say, okay, these are the variables that probably change somewhere in this code. So that sort of helps me wrap my head around things like that. So try and use const. And if you think your value is going to be changing at all, then you can go back and just say, hey, you know what? Let me just make this a let instead of a const. But yeah, that's the general what I try and think about when I'm creating variables and things like that. But definitely use what's comfortable for you. You might join, a code base. You might join a job where you work at a code base where they have different rules and ways to think about things. I'm certainly not saying that, this is the right way to think about it. It's just one of the ways and one of the ways that I think about it. Cool. Does everyone feel like they have a good grasp around variables? Is there anything I can sort of reiterate or talk about? We're going to move on to functions next. The last thing I'll say about variables is that you can assign it to anything, really. So a variable's value can be pretty much anything as long as it's correct syntax, which means we'll see this in just a little bit, but we can do function something. We can also make it an array. These are just different types of data structures. We can make it an object. Something like that. So a variable doesn't care what it's assigned to as long as your syntax is correct. And I think that's important for this next piece that we're going to, or the rest of the pieces we're going to look through. Cool. Looks like everyone feels like they have a pretty solid grasp. Awesome. Let's move on then. So next thing we're going to talk about is functions. And this is another super important piece of JavaScript that you'll run into in pretty much any sense of JavaScript, and something that I think is good to a good place to start when learning JavaScript is this idea that you can write these. You can almost think of them like reusable instructions, but just some pieces of code that's going to run and then give you back something in the end when it's finished. So what that might mean is stepping away from the code, for example, if you think of this as just like a set of instructions, like a grocery list or something, if you were to write a grocery list and say, hey, if you were to hand it to someone and say, hey, go to the grocery store and just pick me up all these items and then bring them back here. That's sort of what a function is doing, right? Because you're creating some instructions, you're telling someone to do something, and then they're going to give you back a return value afterward. And that's really all it is. So if we bring that back, step back into the code level here, we see that we have this function greet return hello world. So let's step through this piece by piece and see what's going on here. If we were to run this function, if we were to go execute this function, it would give us back hello world every time. So we could run this 100 times. It would always give us back the same value. We're going to look at more dynamic versions of this, but anything that comes after your return is the thing that the function is going to give back to you. So the first thing we do, this is similar to let or const. This function is going to be an initializer that tells the JavaScript engine, hey, make new room in memory for something that I'm creating. So this is going to say, I'm going to make new memory. I'm going to assign the value. I'm going to assign the key as greet. So it's going to name the function greet. Again, you can name this anything. It should be closely named to what the function does. So we can see here, again, looking away from the return value, we can say greet. It probably greets something, right? That's probably what it does. It returns you back some sort of greeting. Is there a difference between console log and return? Yes. So console log just means it's going to print a value to the console. A return is just something that gives you back a value. I'll show you a live example of that, of what that means in just a second. But yeah, there is an important difference. And most of the time, you're going to want to be returning and not console logging. Console logging is just for like your benefit to like see something right away. But yeah, you should be using return. Cool. So we'll look at what these parentheses mean, but everything inside of these curly braces is where we're going to write our code. Okay, so we have, again, this is just doing return hello world. It's returning a string. Again, this is a string. It's wrapped in quotes here. It's just a block of text. And that's really all it's doing. It's a pretty simple function. It's going to do the same thing as many times as we want to call it. It'll always give us back the same thing. Cool. So let's look at some code here. Open up our console. Cool. So let's just start off with that, same example. Oh, wait, okay. So, and looking at this, we haven't written any consoles here, and we see we're not getting any value here because we're not logging anything there. So in order to actually do that, we say console log. Does anyone know how we actually execute this function? Does anyone want to take a stab at, hey, we want to see the return value now. What do we do to actually run this thing? Has anyone seen that before, familiar with that? I typed most of it out, but I'm just curious to see if anyone has had experience with that before. And if you're following along, you might have this version of CodePen where you don't have a run button. If you don't have a run button, that just means the code's going to run automatically for you whenever you start to make changes here. But when we want to actually run this function here, we see greet with parentheses. So let me actually show you this version first with the parentheses. And we see we get this return value back. If we were to console log it like that, Omar, that would just print out greet as a string. Anything we wrap in quotations, it's going to treat as a string. So we do this, it's going to literally just print that out. So that's an important difference is to remember. Whenever you wrap things in quotations here, it's literally just going to treat that as a block of text and not something in memory. So we call greet with parentheses here. Does anyone know what would happen if we called greet without the parentheses? And maybe take a guess before running it yourself, just see if you can kind of think about how the JavaScript engine might interpret something like that. And if we, there was a question, oh yeah, Pinar, about returns versus console log. So if we run this without the return, it's just going to give us back undefined because we're not giving anything back from this function. So return is going to give us that value back from the function. So we see some errors, we see some greets, and these are all good guesses. So again, you might think it's perfectly reasonable to think that this would error out if you just do greet, or even just print it out as a string. So let's actually take a look and see. So this is going to log the full function back to us. And remember, as I said earlier, when we define these things in memory, all we're doing is storing some value to some keyword. And that's probably the simple way to think about it and break it down. But that's really all that's happening here, is that we're just assigning some value. This is our value. We're assigning it to some keyword here. So that's almost the same as a regular variable, right? In that greet is just going to be pointing to something in memory. So this gives us back the whole function. So then if we add the parentheses, we actually tell that to run whatever comes back from greet. So you can think about it, if you want to break it down, you can think about it like when we say greet here, this first part, when we do this whole thing, this first part here is just giving us back this whole thing. And then these parentheses are what's actually invoking the function and running whatever comes back from it. So this is saying, hey, go get whatever value this is assigned to, and then try and invoke it with these parentheses. That's sort of the order that things are happening here. And that's why we get this hello world back. So yeah, as I said before, this is a very simple function in that it's not going to be doing much else than returning back hello world. And that's fine for now, but we're gonna look and see how we can make that more dynamic and how we can make it do more than just give us back like a hello world, right? Because this becomes very unuseful for us when we wanna do more than just print hello world. But we'll see that in just a little bit about how we can make that a little bit better. But does everyone feel like they understand that part of functions pretty well? Is there anything I can reiterate there? I think this is a good place to start because it's a very simple version of a function, and we can run it here. We can see what comes back from it. We can get a sense of what our return is doing and what this greet is doing, what these parentheses are doing. But I'm happy to go back to that if anyone has any. If anyone has any questions on that. Yeah, Omar, did you have a? Would this be a time to talk about the new function format? So our functions are a little bit different. I'm trying to think if this would be. So I don't want to overwhelm anyone. So you don't have. Feel free to just like tune this part out because you probably won't use it when you're starting out with JavaScript. But if we had like some func here equals, remember we can set variables equal to functions. We can do something like this and just say return func rand. And we can see that we're running the function just the same as we. Oh yeah, I keep hearing that raise hand button's really easy to hit. Oh yeah, it's like right next to there. I always see a bunch of people do that. It's totally fine. So don't worry about this syntax right now. These are just called fat arrow functions or anonymous functions. They do serve a purpose, but I don't really want to talk about that right now, like what purpose that serves, because I think it'll introduce a bunch of words that will just be a bit too overwhelming. But I think once you get into the idea of objects, like objects in JavaScript and constructing objects, this becomes a lot more clear why fat arrow functions are useful. It's a little bit more than just a little bit more readable. I guess you could argue if this is more or less readable than something like this. But we could do something like this and then get the same result here, where we get the same thing running here. And then we could also, if we wanted to get really fancy with this, we could just do that. And we get the same thing here. So when we have this fat arrow function here, and we put something on the same line, this is called an implicit return. Yeah, as you said that, I started realizing this is way beyond the scope of this webinar. But yeah, if you have questions about this afterward, I'm happy to revisit this. But I probably just don't need to introduce that right now. It just gets kind of fun when you're talking about something and it's just easy to go down that rabbit hole. But I'm happy to talk about that afterward and for anyone that's interested in that. Cool, so let's talk about conditionals. And this is really useful in the context of functions as well, because they allow us to have multiple return values. So you can think about a function that might be useful if you can return multiple things. You can return one thing, but it could be you have different options of what to return from it rather than just like a simple hello world. An example of that would be stepping away from the code here. If we had, say we had a function called family road trip, and then we said there was some type of variable or something that told us whether or not we need gas, if it was true or false. And then we said, you know what, if it's true, return this thing here. If it's false, return this thing here. So we have two return statements in this function. Only one of them is getting used, but it depends on some type of condition to determine which one that is. So stepping into the code level here, it might look something like this. And these things aren't defined in this function, so that's fine. But if we had family road trip, we would write this if here, and then we would have these parentheses, right? And whatever we have in these parentheses is the thing that's going to be evaluated. So this is saying, does need gas equal true? And a conditional is always going to evaluate to either true or false. It's either going to be yes or no. That's the only thing a conditional will ever be evaluated to is just a yes or no. So we say, does need gas equal true? If yes, then run this. Otherwise, do this thing. So let's actually, whoops, skipped ahead there. Let's go back here. Let's see what this might look like in this concept here. If we had like family road trip, right? And then we can say, let's actually define need gas here equals true. Now we can say if need gas equals true. Let's say console.log family road trip. Now, forgot to do the parentheses. Now I get yep because it's true that this equals true. So we can extend this a little bit further and do more than just like, does this equal this? If we can say, let's say we had a number here, right? Let's say we had miles driven, and maybe we drove 50. Yeah, still going. So then we can say something like, does miles driven, is it greater than 100? Let me just clear this editor so we can see a little bit better. Rerun this. Rerun this. Sometimes this takes a little bit. Yeah, if you don't have the run button, sometimes CodePen will just not actually, there we go. So we can do this thing that's more than just, hey, does this equal this? We can say, hey, is this greater than this? Is this less than? We could say greater than or equal to. So if we did it the other way around now, if we flip that, we would get that conditional. So any questions about this type of conditional? This allows us to do different type of mathematical operations, just in the sense of like greater than, less than, equal to. We can do the does equal, we can do the does not equal. We can also do, if you had to, say we had to evaluate more than one thing here. So let's say we had, let's see, we had greater or equal than, let's say 25. We would get this first one here, but then we can also say, and miles driven. We get this other one here. So this double ampersand is when you want to say, are both of these things true? So we're saying, is this part true? And also, is this part true over here? So there is another operation you can do with the double pipes here. You can say or. So ampersand is saying, is every one of these things true? This one is saying, is one or the other true? So because this is true, but this isn't, it still returns true here because we're saying or. It's saying we only want one of these conditions to be true. Cool. Does that make sense? So both of these signs are going to be something that you probably use pretty often, whether it's the pipes or the double ampersand. You'll run into these a lot. Can we put the miles driven inside of here? So yeah, so now that's getting into the concept of parameters and arguments, which we'll see in just a little bit. Is that actually next? Yeah, that is next. So why don't we just go into that? Another, as I said before, we can do like miles driven. Does that equal 50? We can also do does it not equal 50? Because there's some cases where you want to check to make sure things aren't equal, right? Making sure things are separate. So miles driven does not equal 50. So when you want to see if things are the same, use triple equals. When you want to see if they're not the same, use the exclamation double parentheses. Cool, does that make sense? So yeah, this is another example of a function not being very useful because we're sort of hard coding this thing that we're evaluating, right? Miles driven is always going to be the same. It's always going to be 50 or it's always going to be 500, whatever we first assign it to, it's always going to be that thing. So what if we change that to be a little bit more dynamic? So we didn't have to write like a new function to handle every single mile that we drove. So what we might do here is get rid of this here. Let me put some space here and move this over here. So before I actually call this again. So what we did is assigned a parameter. And what we're saying here is that miles driven doesn't exist now, but you're telling JavaScript to expect that whenever we call family road trip, again, whenever we call family road trip, we're saying, hey, you should expect a value to be passed in along with this function call. So again, we're just printing it out here to give us the full function. But if we were to do something like 100, now we would get a real return here. And let's just say greater than 50, so it makes a bit more sense. And then we can pass in different values here. But this allows us a great deal of flexibility, right? Because we're not just hard coding a single value. We're sort of passing that in. We're passing that in when we call the function. And we can do sort of whatever we want. We can, inside of here, we can treat this like it's a normal variable because this is our parameter. Again, we're just saying that expect when this function is called, expect a value to be passed in along with it. Does that make sense, Omar and everyone else? Any questions about that? So we can also, we can pass in multiple parameters here. We can say something like A, B, let's say C, D. And we can use these inside of our function. Let me just copy this. It doesn't keep printing errors to the console. So what if we wanted to say, hey, is this greater than 50? If it's not, check something else. So we could do something in JavaScript called else ifs if we want to evaluate more than one statement. Oh, this format's so weird. So we can say B is greater than 50. And second condition. How did you get the input in the family road trip? So that, do you mean these values up here? The A's and the B's that I changed these to? Everything like that will be passed in when we call the function, when we actually invoke the function down here. So we could do C greater than, let me just do 3 here just for the sake of the argument here. So yeah, when we call this function, we can do 50, 50, 20. So this should hit the last one here. So when we actually invoke this function, we want to pass in the values that will get replaced here with these these parameters will get replaced with the values that we pass in here. So 50 will map to A, this 50 will map to B, and this 55 will map to C. So if we're to change this now to 60, our first condition will be hit now because this first conditional is coming back true. So whatever values we pass in here will map to our parameters. But you want to make sure you have the same number of parameters as you do values that you're passing in. So if we had like D, E here, we should kind of decrease the limit here because we're only using 3 here. So we shouldn't have leftover parameters here that we don't need to use. In this case, we're only using 3, so we should only have 3 parameters here. Does that make sense? And hopefully that answers your question. I'm not sure if that's what you were referring to, but I'm happy to reiterate or show another example of something else would be more helpful. So another example here might be if we have maybe a more useful example, we have like an add function where we want to return, let's say in our, oh, not the right way. Let's say in our add we have A and B. Maybe we want to return A plus B. So now we've essentially created a function where we can add any 2 numbers together, and we see we get 15 down here. And we can certainly just keep changing up the numbers and getting different values out there. So this is a pretty flexible example of how we can see where we can sort of make these different mathematical functions that will return us some type of value at the end. If now we say we want to revisit our initial one, let's get rid of everything. And if people are still filling up to another pop quiz, we had our initial function. The first thing we looked at was something like this, right? Where we call greet and it gives us back the same hello world, however many times we call it. But let's say we're making a website, right? And someone comes to us and says, hey, you know what? We have this hello world on our front page, but now we want to be able to greet a person when they sign up for an account. So basically we want to say, hey, we want to create a function that says, hello and then the first name of whatever person. And this could be a real world example. You probably create something like this. But right now, if we have this function run whenever we want to show this to the user on the front end, it's only going to show them hello world. Does anyone have can anyone think of a way where we could make this, say if we wanted to say hello Ryan here, instead of making a function that says, hey, greet Ryan, hello Ryan, this would certainly work, but this would get very tiring having to create a new function every time we want to, greet someone by their first name, right? We don't want to have to create a new function for that. So how can we take this and any other function and combine it into this single function there? Yeah, what might that look like? And then for the sake of just showing the repetition of it all, so you want to take this and just combine all of this into a single function. Cool, looks like Omar is volunteering to lead that charge. So if we do greet name, what else would we do here? And let me just comment that out. What would we do here after we do greet name like this? What would we actually want inside of our function call now? I think I see where you're going with this, and I think we can certainly do it that way. But the idea here being is that we just want to say hello, hello person, hello name. If anyone else. So Tim, are you thinking something like this? I'm guessing you're more along the lines thinking of something like this. Yeah, so so it looks like Michael's even got the space there. So now we can get rid of those. We can say greet. We can say I have an extra parameter there. So we only want the one parameter for that. And that space will give us an extra bit of formatting, or we can also get super fancy and say, this way we don't have to care about any sort of spaces. You can just do it the ES6 way. I much prefer this way just because I hate having to do plus space plus whatever and worry about all that. This way it just allows you to quickly insert those variables whenever you need to. And if you want to do it that way, you just do backticks. Oops. You just do backticks and then whatever string you want. And then when you want to insert a variable, $ curly braces, variable name. And this is sort of an ES6 way to insert variables into strings. And we get that same output there. And we could see that we could do that however many times you wanted to, and we would get the same result there with different names. So you'd have a similar real world function. If you think about if you've ever signed up for a new website or something or created an account somewhere, you probably got some sort of greeting like this, right? It probably wasn't this simple, but the same idea applies that they're creating something like this and just using this logic to greet you when you make an account. How do you know what name? So if you mean here, name is going to be whatever we pass in when we call the function here. So let me clear that. So we can see right here is when it prints out that last one. Name is just going to be equal to whatever we pass in at the time when we call the function. Cool. Any part of that, I want to give you time to work on some challenges, and maybe we can work through some together. But does anyone have any part of that that we, not just this, but anything we went over that would be valuable for me to reiterate or kind of talk about again, or any questions at all? Feel free to let me know if anything comes up. I'm happy to go back at any time and relook at that. So Paul, I wouldn't think of them as necessarily inputs. I mean, they certainly are. I think that word has several meanings depending on the context you're talking about. But you can think of it as an input command here. It's just assigning a value inside of a function. So this is replacing name here. This is replacing name here. Paul is replacing name here. But if that's how you're thinking about it, then yeah. Remember, we can have as many as we want if we wanted to have multiple names, something like that. Cool. So we did that. And again, this is the adder function that we looked in again, where you can pass in multiple parameters in your declaration and just, return two values. You can also do this with strings. If you had like two strings you wanted to concatenate together, I guess this could serve multiple purposes. But you can also just use it to add numbers together. We looked at that example. Cool. So with these challenges you'll look at, feel free to Google some of the problems you might run into. I think any developer at any level will tell you that they constantly use Google as a resource to problem solve. Specifically Stack Overflow. I use this constantly throughout the day. And it's sort of like a Google for programmers. You just, any problem that you might have, it's probably been asked and answered on Stack Overflow. So it's a great resource when you run into issues to reference that and see if, if it solves any of your problems. This is one I'm using constantly. So if you run into any problems, not just with these challenges, but in the future, if you keep going with this, I would bookmark that and go through that if you get stuck on anything. So on this last slide here, not the last slide, but on this slide, you'll get a link to these challenges. And if you click these, it'll open up a new tab for you, and I'll just show you what this looks like. You can sign in. So you have to sign in or sign up to do this, but you can also make like just a dummy account. If you want to save these things and look at them later on, you can make a real account to save these too. But you definitely don't have to. So we could do something like this. So this will take you to here, and then you can just do first, last. Again, if you want to save these things for later on, put in real information for this account so you can access that later. But right now, if you just want to go through it real quick, just put in dummy info. So once you get there, you'll see this intro to JavaScript you can click on, and you'll have these challenges here. And some of these get a little bit, I would start at the top and go down. Some of these get a little bit challenging, but I think working through one by one will be a good place to start. And yeah, when you click into these, it'll open up to the instructions on the right side here. And then here's where you can actually like write stuff and see it run here in the console. Cool. If that is everything, I think I will end tonight's webinar for the night. I hope everyone has a great rest of your night or evening, depending on where you are. And I do hope to see you in a future session, and feel free to check out some of our other awesome instructors for some of the courses they teach. There's a lot of cool JavaScript, Python, data science ones. We have this pretty much almost every day of the week. So yeah, definitely give those a view if you're interested in any of those topics. Otherwise, Yeah, enjoy the rest of your night, everyone. Thanks for hanging out here. And I will see you all later.